Welcome, everybody, to another live stream on Palestine Bookshelf. I always say that I defer to you all to get names of books, documentaries, and you've been very helpful in the past. And one of the way that I got a hold of this documentary, and things, one thing leads to another. So, for example, one of you had recommended My Neighborhood, which featured a young Mohammed Al Kurd. It was a wonderful documentary, I think quite underrated, not really appreciated, even on our own channel. And then I, in worry, looked to see, was this young boy killed? He wasn't, thankfully, and in fact had grown up into a very articulate apologist for Palestine, Muhammad Al Kurd. And then I read his book, Perfect Victims, one of the finest books we read on the bookshelf. All this came from someone emailing me and saying, Stephen, would you consider reviewing this 25-minute documentary? So this gets us to this summer. I am traveling. I think I was in Cornwall at the time, and someone had messaged and said, "Hey, someone reached out and said that we should speak." And so I'm calling. We set a meeting time, and I told Alice, I said, "Well, it's your meeting, so I'm happy to follow whatever you have in mind." And she said, "Oh, I thought you wanted to meet me." And in any case, I laughed at that point because I thought, oh, okay, well, someone had tried to make the connection. And so I think that's the only thing I would tweak is if you're trying to make a connection with someone, try to what is as someone who told me a long time ago, use the idea of the double opt-in. So check with both parties that you're trying to introduce whether they want to be introduced to each other, and then make that a very clear connection, as opposed to what happened here. Someone vaguely told Alice you should meet Steven, and then I'm confused as to why she's reaching out. This person has made this wonderful film. In any case, we got over that. I'm very glad for whoever made the connection. Thank you. And I get to hear about Alice's own awakening as a Jew to what was happening in Palestine, and then her advocacy work, her work as an activist. And this documentary, I think, is just one very fine example of that. Very underrated. I saw it's on her channel. First of all, she only has 192 subscribers, which is crazy to me, given how wonderful this documentary is. And then the documentary itself only has 3.6 thousand views, so a little under 4,000 views for a documentary that came out in 2012, 2013. So definitely try to give some publicity to this documentary. I think it's great, and it's something that very much comes from the heart. If you see the way that Alice talks all throughout the documentary, her earnestness, her seriousness, her dedication to the cause is evident. And she took the time to make this great contribution with the sort of care of making sure that she had to edit and figure out, what am I going to use in this documentary? And then she even, I think, commissioned some original music, which played very well in the background. This reminds me of Dr. Alam Mutasib's work on 1948 Creation and Catastrophe, not chancing to just put up videos and audios and graphs, but telling a story, and a story sometimes includes music in addition to graphics. So that's something that I would have really wanted to thank Alice for if she were able to join us on the stream. And if she's watching this later, Alice, thank you so much for your work on this. So a lot of the interviews for this, not all of them, but a lot, came from a project she did where she just invited people to come up on stage at an event, and she recorded and she took clips of that to talk about what had happened. And she had said in the beginning of her own journey of discovery, she really looked at 1967 as a major departure point, which of course it is. That's when the occupation really begins in earnest. But it was necessary to go back to 1948 and highlighting the entire craziness of the present absentee law, that if you were absent from your property, even for one day, you were classified as a present absentee. You couldn't return. She also platforms what we more rarely see. I understand why. They're a smaller part of the population, Palestinian Christians, but I still really loved to see it. Obviously, as my own co-religionists, there was a woman who, I think she's from Ramallah, and her family was not from there originally. They were displaced. and talked about the idea of there being lessons in the neighborhood that soldiers would come and beat people up and break bones and set examples, lessons. And her parents were Catholic and said, these soldiers are young, they don't know what they're doing, we should pray for them. And I thought that that was a wonderful thing. I have seen that articulated in other ways in other documentaries, but I do think that that is a necessarily Christian response. I would argue, even if they did know what they were doing, that you have to pray for your enemies. As a Christian, this is a responsibility I take on for myself. But the idea is, um, even these people who were close to what was happening, they still thought that soldiers could have been too young to know what they were doing. I think with hindsight, we were able to see that a lot of these soldiers were true believers and that they were raised in a certain type of programming, and that's part of who they are and what they wanted, what they believed about Zionism. So I think that's important for us to recognize. Um, there's also, we see here different responses from different people, that we have um, people who chose to stay and people who left. So we have people going to Canada and Syria, Colombia, even America. And sometimes there is no hope. I've always said we can't, while I champion the principle of Samud, I also champion the idea of Palestinians choosing what it is that they want to do with their life. We can't tell them, you must remain here on the land. We can encourage Samud and we can desire Samud, but ultimately it's not our lives. It's their lives, it's their land. And a lot of these kids who were telling the story of their parents said that when they no longer felt as if they had a voice in their own country, that's when they chose to leave. And I think we have to respect the feelings of those people in relation to how they were going to raise their families and what kind of lives they were going to provide for their families. So that has to be respected as well. Although I've articulated before, and others have, that a lot of people do regret leaving Palestine, even as difficult as life was there and as easy and comfortable as life is in their new adopted countries, that many of them wish they had stayed. And some of them, in the end, which I think was a very poignant question, very beautiful question, Alice asked, what is home for you? And the the answer a lot of people gave was there. Didn't matter where they had lived for 20 years. They thought of Jerusalem as their home, Gaza as their home, the West Bank, their village that has been destroyed and paved underground and had a forest planted over it. They still think of that as their home. And I've said before that moderns, we don't have the attachment to the land that the Palestinians so often display, because up until very recently, they were living a life that had mostly disappeared from Western Europe and from the United States, maybe a century before the Industrial Revolution. That the Industrial Revolution was just coming to Palestine in the 1920s. And we've done a film club review of the Al Jazeera documentary, Palestine 1920. I would recommend watching that documentary if you want to check out my film club review of it. But we could see that this was happening, but it wasn't happening to the extent that it happened in Western Europe, where everything was suddenly going to become factories everywhere. It was Palestine was and remains a very rich agricultural land. And so that was always going to continue, but there was going to be better methods of transportation, better methods of export. Everything was set up for Palestine to become a wealthy part of the, um, you could argue, global economy. That's a separate conversation as to the goodness or the rightness of the global economy, but they've always been geographically sought. Alexander the Great came through Palestine as well. There's many people who've come through that area. It's a vital road, part of what's on a Palestinian kafia. When you ask people, uh, when you try to explain to people what's on a kafia, one of those are the lines. The lines there are the roads that went from Cairo up into the Levant and beyond. This is part of what made Palestine so prosperous in the past. It was a connecting point between parts of the world, and they had their own agriculture. They had many wonderful things to contribute. Famous soaps, I think, of Haifa or Jaffa. I'm happy to be corrected on that. I'm not remembering, but there are people, they had industries that were known and that were famous and were already being sold into Europe at that time, before what happened, before the catastrophe. They, I think it was, she has a lawyer on there as well. I'm trying to remember her name's Diane. Last name starts with a B, Batu maybe. But she talks about the fact that Oslo was not about a peace agreement, it was a surrender agreement. And if I'm attributing this quote to the wrong person, I'm happy to be corrected in the comments. But that's, I think, a wonderful way of thinking about it. They don't want a peace agreement, they want a surrender agreement. That's what the Israelis want. And she Alice takes us to a fairly optimistic note at the end of the documentary, which I wish I could share. I appreciate the spirit of what she's looking for there. I'm optimistic about the future. And this was in 2012, 2013. We're post summer rains. We're post cast lead. I think we're before protective edge. So things are still pretty terrible, but they're only getting worse. But there seemed to be optimism there because BDS had started out in 2005 and it had a pretty good start. The Israelis started to panic and started to act against BDS. And now we have 35 US states which have effectively anti BDS legislation that you cannot get a government contract if you support in any way any kind of boycott of the state of Israel, which is a crazy that these are laws on the books. And when the laws are ruled as unconstitutional, illegal, they go back and they rewrite the laws to try to make them legal. So um, I appreciate the idea too. Towards the end, she talks about voices softening. I think she's trying to create bridges between the Palestinians and I wouldn't say the Israelis, the Jews, because the examples are Jews who are in alliance with Palestinians, and providing an alternate connection, an alternate worldview, trying to remove the not all from the dialogue. And these people said, my voice started softening. I started understanding that perspective a bit more. And I think that probably helps their advocacy. But I still say that it's something to really consider, that the optimism at the end of the documentary, sometimes it's just something that we tell ourselves because we can't end something on a down note. I think this is something Norm Finkelstein gets accused of a lot, and I support him when he answers, well, what do you want me to say? Do you want me to say that things are really hopeful? So I appreciate the direction that Alice went in the documentary, ending on a hopeful note. And who am I to disbelieve the survivors? They have optimism. They're allowed to have optimism. Perhaps it's the fact that it doesn't involve me directly, that I didn't lose my home, that I'm simply trying to be an advocate for Palestinians. That's easier for me to be not optimistic. But when I say that I'm not optimistic, what I mean to say is I don't believe that we can create long-term political change at this moment. It doesn't seem that way. However, there are things that are moving below the surface that are moving towards that. And there is more knowledge about the Israeli-Palestinian issue even now than ever before. And I'm sure it was true for Alice and that team in 2012, 2013 as well. So as I say, I understand the direction of travel. I understand the reason for optimism. And I respect that the actual survivors of the Nakba and the Naksa have that optimism. However, there are plenty who don't have that optimism as well. We saw this in No Other Land, as our documentarians are on the road talking together, and he says this is the work of decades. And even that, back in 2012, it's a decade on from that. There's still more work to do. But I suppose what I want to commend Alice for, and commend everyone who was a participant in the documentary, is for doing that hard work. We're not here. She is part of doing the work that makes projects like Palestine Bookshelf even possible. We're going back to their work, their documentation, their narration. Without documentaries, documentarians and documentaries like this one, we don't have these voices. These voices could have just been silenced, would have been lost to history. But instead, we have testimonies of what life was like and what these people were going through and what they felt. And I think it's really, really vital. The documentary is only 1 hour, so you have no excuse not to watch it. It's linked in the description. And if you find Alice online, I'll try to put a link to her website as well, and the other projects she's involved in. I think she's written a book. Please send her a thank you for her work. I will certainly be doing so. And if there are no, I don't see any questions in the live chat, I will end today's stream. Thanks for stopping by, and check out the documentary, and I'll see you on the next film club.